Welcome to Voices That Represent, a podcast brought to you by Unveiled, Bridging the Gap to Sponsorship. This is Shahana Mukherjee, and as founder and president, I am thrilled to have you join us on this journey. In a world where opportunities are not distributed equitably, our mission is clear: to break the cycle of underrepresented groups being over-mentored and under-sponsored. Throughout this podcast series, we will delve into the stories and experiences that have been invisible for far too long. We aim to bring these voices to the forefront, making them visible in spaces where they have traditionally been absent. Equally important is the exploration of the role of sponsors, who play a crucial part in being a voice for those who often find themselves on the sidelines, unheard and unseen. Join us as we engage in thought-provoking conversations to navigate bridging the gaps to equitable access, one voice at a time. Voices That Represent is not just a podcast. It's a platform dedicated to fostering understanding, collaboration, and tangible, positive change.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Voices That Represent. Today, I'm here with Marsha Dawkins. Marsha is a communications and leadership expert, and she has written books about the importance of identity and how we use our identity or not use our identity at work. Marsha, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm really excited to talk to you and your listeners. There are usually three things I like to say about myself. The first is that I love stories and storytelling. So if you met me as a kid from Queens, New York, you would have met me with a book or a pencil in my hand. The book would have been something like The Velveteen Rabbit, which is all about how you use your identity. And I realize now how other people see your identity and choose to believe it or not. You might have also seen me scribbling with a pencil, which was actually really hard to do because I had a developmental challenge that made it very difficult for me to learn how to write. That's the first thing. I love stories. The second thing I got to say is that I study stories. So I have my PhD in communication from USC's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, where I was also a professor for several years. And that's really where I learned to recognize leadership lessons in unexpected places and use the power of storytelling. And some of those unexpected places are what we're seeing right now with Beyonce and Cowboy Carter and this music. Others are in the lyrics of artists like Eminem, or even children's books, as I've mentioned before. And then finally, the thing I like to say about myself is that I'm an open book. So I'm not one of those people who's like a sage on the stage. I like to share openly from my personal experience, as well as the knowledge and research that I've been able to conduct and collect over the years to make a difference and create possibilities for others.
Thank you, Marsha. And we have one thing in common. I am also an open book, and I love that I get to have this conversation with you and that we could just be open and transparent about what is important for us to share. One of the things that you mentioned is storytelling. And with Unveiled and Voices That Represent, we want to share stories of different experiences that people have, especially as they're trying to navigate their careers. And today we're talking more around the importance of sharing stories and experiences, particularly with sponsorship. We talk a lot about underrepresented groups in the workplace and different communities. Can you share with me your thoughts around the importance of sponsorship?
The first issue I think that needs to be overcome when we talk about sponsorship is bias. We tend to think about diversity and difference as physical traits. And that is not as easy or clear cut when it comes to the neurodiverse community. And so because these differences aren't seen, they often go also unheard and therefore ignored. And so when I think about the importance of sponsorship, it's important for everybody, and all the more so for members of this community. And I think it's important when we say the word sponsorship. For me, as a communicator and storyteller, I want to be really precise with what I mean. It takes a lot for me to recognize someone as a sponsor. A lot of times I think sponsors are confused with mentors. So someone who gives you coaching and guidance, but it pretty much stops there. When I say sponsor, I'm talking about someone who gives you that support, that coaching, that guidance for sure, but then takes it 2 steps further. The first is to advocate for you. So to explain why you need the things that you need, or you're prepared for the opportunities that you are indeed prepared for. And then beyond that, to champion you, to take your name, to take your identity and your work into rooms that it wouldn't normally get into. And so unless we're talking about all those 3 steps, that coaching and support, the advocating and the sponsorship, I'm not willing to call somebody a sponsor.
I love the way that you phrased this, to be able to take your identity into rooms that your identity wouldn't be typically in. I would love for you to share an example of when you have seen that happen.
My first book, called Clearly Invisible: Racial Passing and the Color of Cultural Identity, really looked at instances where this didn't happen. So I looked at people who were in different parts of life and had to pass as other identities, whether it was racial, Black passing as white, for example, or woman passing as man, or someone who's from the LGBTQ plus community passing as straight, in order to take themselves into a room where they wouldn't otherwise get into. But when we talk about sponsorship, it's that relation of where someone is able to be themselves and another person recognizes and champions that. There's 2 pieces of work, one old and one new, that I'm working on right now that talk about this. The older piece of work is a book I wrote about Eminem called Eminem, the Real Slim Shady. This is a powerful example of what happens when someone supports you, advocates for you, and champions you. I had the privilege, as a result of writing this book and speaking a lot about the impact of Eminem's work, to do a podcast when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2022. And in that podcast, we talked about exactly this. And when I went to see him get inducted, the speech that Dr. Dre gave for him talked exactly about this, that because his sponsor knew what it was like to not be welcome and not be valued for who he was, he knew how to advocate and exactly what to say to get his sponsee into the places where he needed to go. So it's also about who your sponsor is, what their identity is, and how they know how to kind of work those rooms to get you into those places. So that's one public example. But number 2, for those listeners who care about today's popular culture, my first example is kind of dating me a little bit. We can see this happening right now in pop culture and media. So we see Beyonce's record-generating record, Cowboy Carter. And we see here how she says this was born out of an experience of not being welcomed. And so she chose to use this project as an opportunity to support, advocate, and champion the work of others, because she didn't want other people to feel the way that she had felt. And so we see it unfolding in real time with the artists that she's working with, all of a sudden getting way more streams and attention, including established artists like Dolly Parton herself is having success she'd never had before, not to mention the younger artists like Rhiannon Gibbons. So we are seeing how leaders at different industries and at different places and points in their career and with different identities learn how to sponsor. And the fascinating thing for me, Wanda, as a communicator, is that it really is a bad story turned good. It's these stories of unwelcoming, of exclusion, and then evolution and resilience turned around into creating possibilities and opportunities for other people.
All of this is so incredibly important and actually beautifully said. I think that is the key. And to connect it back to voices that represent and unveiled, it is exactly what we're trying to do, to open up the doors and create possibilities for other people so that they have the opportunities to thrive. One of the things that you said was around finding the sponsors that understand your struggle and understand what it is like to not be welcomed. It's so clear that that is an important thing to do, but it's not so easy. Can you share some tips for our audience members who may have felt that they are feeling unwelcome or don't have the opportunities? What are some ways that they could find the right people to connect with?
So for me, it's been about getting to know people, particularly in the workplace, and talking about more than just the projects that we're working on, but really being what I call an inviter or an invitational leader to create experiences where people can begin to show up and have these very important and often all too difficult conversations. So that might be a series of like pair and shares at the organization where I work, we call them, where we just decide to get together with another colleague for 15 or 20 minutes and just have a conversation. No work-related conversation is allowed. And it's actually through there that I was able to connect with other people who are connected to the neurodiverse community in my organization. And through there, you have one person begins to lead you to the next and begins to lead you to the next. So that's one way, especially helpful for people who are a little bit more introverted rather than announcing oneself. I'd like to be sponsored, right? It doesn't quite work that way. Another way is to also think about how we can leverage the internet to help us with this. And so there are several organizations where we can begin to access resources that can help us. And that is often safer. So I'd like to share some of those resources that I found along the way in hopes that they can be useful to some of your listeners as well.
That would be really great.
One that I've spent a little time with recently is Kennedy Krieger Institute's Neurodiversity in the Workplace. They have a conference where they talk about sponsorship and they actually offer sponsorship packages for members of this community. So I think that's one way. We have to begin to do the research ourselves and find out what is out there. There's also an organization called, I believe it's called Neurodiversity at Work, and it's under a larger organization called Diversity and Inclusion Leaders. They also offer sponsorship opportunities for folks. They help with starting ERGs, for example, strictly for neurodiverse community members. There's also a workshop called Neurodiversity at Work Research that is seeking sponsors. So if you are someone who would like to be a sponsor, there's also a place that you can get involved. Because I think too often the burden is put on the person who is neurodiverse to go out and find this relationship. And it would be so much better and more just and more appropriate and developmental from a career perspective for the sponsors to begin to seek other people out.
Yeah, and I think that's the reality for a lot of underrepresented groups is that the task is left to them to really open up the doors and create opportunities and be looking for all of the ways that they can find that avenue for growth. And it would be great if we were living in a society where we could make that easier. I have another question. I was thinking about your story around Eminem and how he was given this opportunity because of such a great sponsor that he had. What we gained from him having those doors open for him was a ton of innovation in the music industry. And I want to see what your thoughts are around innovation, neurodiversity, inclusion, and why it's important to ensure that we're opening the doors for people who may not think the same way.
You're talking about what we as a society and a world and a community gain from acknowledging people and providing space for them to be exactly who they are. That's how we need to ask this question. So I'm just really happy. And I'll tell you why, going back to being an open book. I am the parent to a neurodiverse child, and it was a long journey for me to realize my own biases and the changes that I need to make to allow my child to thrive. And that the burden was not on my child, first of all, because my child is a child, but secondly, because the burden should not be on the person who is different. The burden should be on the person who has more privilege. And that is me in this case as a neurotypical person. And so I had to, for example, deal with the fact that neurodiversity is not something to be overcome, but rather an experience and a way of living that someone goes through life perfectly fine and healthy with. But it is we who have not found in this society spaces for those people to necessarily prosper and thrive in the traditional ways. So that's one thing. And from media, I just want to highlight this. I was looking at, for example, the Nobel Prize recent winners, and there's here a scientist named Carol Greider. And just the way this is written is exactly the opposite of the way you phrase this question. They write, Carol Greider achieved success in molecular biology in the same way she overcame dyslexia as a child, with persistence and creativity. She's discovered telomerase, an enzyme that's key to the aging process and the growth of cancer cells. And what stands out to me there is this idea of Carol overcame dyslexia. If you talk to anyone who experiences dyslexia, which I prefer to call 3D thinking after doing the research, you'll find, for example, that this is nothing that anyone ever overcomes. This is an experience that a person has. And because of that experience, they see and do things and think about things differently. And what we gain from that, for example, is something that is key to understanding a life-threatening illness like cancer and potentially how to cure it. In a case of artists and musicians, new ways of seeing and doing things. When I think about innovation, I think about folks who are neurodiverse being so involved with technology. The very keyboard that we type on and systems that we are using to record this interview today were created by neurodiverse people. So much of things that we take for granted were born out of this ability to quite literally think differently. And the burden is on those of us who identify as neurotypical to acknowledge that, to advocate for that, and then to champion these individuals so that they can continue to be themselves, first of all, and secondly, present these gifts to the world that make all of our lives so much better. And isn't that always the case, irrespective of the different aspects of diversity we might talk about, is that simply by giving people the space to be themselves, we all benefit and enjoy the consequences.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And you have highlighted a lot of very positive examples of people who have received the platform and the sponsorship and the opportunities to be who they are. And because of that, we have seen a lot of innovation, some of which we're using right now. But the reality is that there are so many more people who are not being given the opportunity. And there's not a lot of information or data in the workforce and the lack of career opportunities that they've had. And I'm curious around your thoughts, how do we move the needle? We have these great positive examples, but there could be so many more.
The first reason I'll give you for why we don't have this kind of research is because people are still passing. It is not safe for people to necessarily self-identify as neurodiverse at work. It's just not. There are organizations where if a person takes a meeting with their camera off, just as you and I are doing now, and we've talked about so we can concentrate better and not get distracted and stay focused. If a person does this in certain organizational cultures, they are considered rude. They are considered to be not present. They are considered to be somehow less than, because they need to process the information that's coming at them differently. So it is overwhelmingly still not safe for folks to identify this way. And so when we don't have folks identifying this way, then it's very difficult to conduct research and to get those kind of hard numbers. So how do we get around this or work through this? And this is where it really comes back to storytelling. When we are able to make relationships with one another and we are able to identify with one another, we have to begin telling our stories. And so it's important for me to tell my story as a parent of a neurodiverse individual. And it's important for me to be really open about that so that I can make these way for others. And so that really comes back to the qualitative part of it all. We need to find a way for people to tell their stories one by one so that we can get these larger facts and figures that make it so much easier for us to make arguments about policy and organizational culture change, and even just raise awareness so that we can pair people with sponsors who will do right by them. So that's the beginning, and that's the age-old problem of dealing with pretty much any aspect of diversity, at least in Western cultures, is that for as long as it's still overwhelmingly unsafe, doing the research is going to be overwhelmingly difficult.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, your personal story, and for encouraging others to share their stories. Because I think you're right. I think it is so hard to be open about something that is so intimate and private for families, whether it's you as an individual that is experiencing a difference or if it's a family member. It is not an easy thing to say in society, I'm seen as different and I don't feel safe talking to people about that. It's hard to acknowledge it.
You know, what I'm hearing, Wanda, from you that I think it's important that your listeners also really, really hear emphasized is the stigma that we're dealing with when we talk particularly about neurodiversity. It's cute to have young Sheldon, the TV show. It's cute to think about Mr. Spock from Star Trek, but it's different when this is happening in your life. And you don't know if you're going to get that next promotion or even get that job that you're interested in or that opportunity to work on a cross-functional project because of the way that you may be perceived in your organization. I think these examples that we are giving are important, and we need to keep telling those stories. We need to keep seeing this representation in places where it matters, like media and popular culture. We can even look to the current US president, who is a stutterer that we know now is part of neurodiversity. So these folks are out there and these stories are out there, but until we can show people how this intersects and simply just relates to their own life experiences, whether they are aware of it or not, whether they identify as neurodiverse or not, is really, to me, the crux of an issue. So for me, for example, as someone who had a lot of bias around this, and then doing the research, because it started to matter to me, that's human nature, we're selfish that way because of my child. But then secondly, to see that the world around me has been to such a large degree shaped by members of this community was life-changing. And that made me want to learn more, and that made me want to do more and say more to create more possibilities for other folks. So what I want to say out there is, whether we are experts or not, the important thing is telling our stories.
Yes, absolutely. And what I would love to be able to see, and I think I could say this on behalf of Unveiled, is that we need to try to make it a safer space.
Thinking about this, I'm a Gen Xer, so going back to being an open book, I think about how many of us in my generation identify as neurotypical simply because we did not have this vocabulary or any safe spaces back when we were growing up, especially through adolescence. And so there may be, certainly are, more members to this community than we even admit. But because of stigma, because of culture, and lack of simply words to describe these experiences, we still don't have that information. But we, again, can change this through the power of what we're doing today, which is telling these stories and working to create these safe and safer spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Marcia. I've learned so much from the conversation, and I think this is a conversation that we must keep having. And I would love to continue the dialogue, really start to open the space for people to share their stories, to feel like we are listening and that there is room for there to be equitable opportunities for all.
Show us some love. Like, subscribe, share, and tell us, what questions do you want answered in a future episode?